Hi, I'm Miles Showell. I'm a mastering engineer here at Abbey Road Studios. This is the room where I work and the room where I mastered the 11 album box set for the Alan Parsons Project's complete studio recording set. Alan Parsons has a long history at Abbey Road because this is where he started his career, as far as I'm aware. He started at EMI in the late 1960s and came up through the ranks, learned how to... In fact, originally he started cutting records because that was the EMI way. You learnt what you could cut onto a disc before you became an engineer, so that you then knew what was actually physically possible to record and would cut well on a record. So he started here in the late 60s, eventually became a solo artist and, producing other records for other people like John Miles and for Pilot, and then the Alan Parsons Project. And he recorded, I think 7 or 8 of the albums were recorded in this building. I'm a bit younger than Alan, so I discovered it on the radio. Literally, I would hear these songs. I think probably the first song I was aware of would have been Time, which was about 79, 80, I guess that came out. It would be my educated guess. And I would have heard that. It wasn't a massive hit in the UK, but it was a big radio hit, especially in London. Capital Radio played it all the time. So I was well aware of that. And then 2 or 3 years later, Eye in the Sky came out, and I loved that. In fact, I bought that when it came out in 83. So I became aware of it after the event. I wasn't in at the beginning because I was a bit too young for that. I was chuffed to be asked to be involved in this because Alan's part of the fabric of this building. So to have all the masters come back into here and for me to have a go at them and do my work on them was a real privilege. You have to imagine that a record is a mechanical recording of a sound wave. So what you hear from your speakers are wavy grooves carved into a disc. And we have to literally rotate the turntable on the lathe that's behind me here. There's a recording stylus and a special cutter head which vibrates, and that etches the grooves in. You mustn't think high tech with records. The system of a flat disc with a groove in it goes back to about 1887. So it's a low tech format. The fact that Neumann and other people managed to make it sound so amazing is a tribute to their engineering skills. But you still have the physical process of having to carve a groove into a disc. The problem you have there is if you have lots of high frequency information in a recording, that's very difficult to cut. It needs a lot of current from the amplifiers, and the system gets hot and gets stressed and you run out of headroom. So if you slow everything down, cut it in half, cut it down by a factor of 2, then you give the cutting head twice as long to carve that intricate groove. So all the difficult to cut high frequency information, the difficult grooves, become much easier to cut mid-range. It's pretty dreadful for me as an engineer to sit here listening to the music at half speed. Trust me, it's not fun. But when you then get the records back and you play them, and it's just, whoa, this is incredible. You kind of forget you're playing a record half the time. It just sounds a lot better. And I've yet to hear a genre of music that doesn't benefit from being cut half speed. It's very difficult to get hold of original master tapes now. That's the main problem. A lot of the major companies are being very precious about lending their tapes out. Even to a studio as famous as Abbey Road, we can struggle sometimes to get hold of original tapes. In addition to that, with this series of albums, there's a vast majority of them. There are actually 2 sets of masters run. So there was the original set, which went to Arista Records, which is now the library of which is owned by Sony. Those were the main de facto masters. But at the same time, there was a parallel machine running, and there was a set of tapes that were given to Eric Wolfson, who was the composer for most of this material. And he pretty much put his tapes on a shelf where they sat forever, and they've hardly been touched. So those tapes are in much better condition in a lot of cases than the tapes that are looked after by Sony, because they haven't been played. each time you run an analog tape through a machine, you're wearing it out. You know, you're scraping bits of oxide off of the tape. So it gets worse with every pass. So it's becoming a difficult situation, and it's becoming not good practice to continually run old analog tapes, because we are starting to wear them down. So in the case of Sony, they didn't want to release any of their tapes. They only gave us high resolution copies. Or if it was a digital recording, they gave us a straight transfer of whatever the digital recording was. Normally 44.1 kilohertz, 16-bit. A couple of the later ones were higher resolution than that. For the Eric Wolfson tapes, they're in an archive that's not easily accessible, but they have made some very high resolution transfers from those. And I was able to compare Eric's tape with the Sony tape and pick the best one, the best sounding tape for the job. Normally it was Eric's tape. A couple of times the Sony tape beat it, and for a couple of the albums Eric didn't have tapes of them, so we had to use Sony's. But I've literally sat down and gone through everything, every possible source that we could use, and found the best one. In terms of sound quality, to use higher resolution digital, it does give you the ability to micromanage the audio in ways you could not do in the analog domain. A couple of the tracks, Alan said, "Oh, the vocal sounds a little bit like there's too much de-essing on there," and I said, "Well, that's on the tape. That's how it's recorded. I haven't done any de-essing to this." But I was able to fix the problems and do work which you could never do with EQ and in the analog domain. So in some respects, you can actually get a far nicer sounding result by working with digital files. But you have to, there's digital and digital. It's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's what you do with it that counts. So if you had a low resolution like CD master file which has been compressed and is too loud and nasty, that doesn't cut well, that doesn't sound good. I wouldn't want to do that for a half-speed album. That just, there's no point. It's supposed to be a high-quality medium. So you have to go with high resolution, treat it sensitively, and don't go crazy with the compression and limiting, because you don't need that for vinyl. In fact, it's fundamentally bad for vinyl. So I didn't do any digital limiting at all in this set. It's all very pure. And in reality, your turntable arm and your cartridge combination and your phono preamp have far greater effect on the sound of a record than the source I use when I'm working from very high resolution. So in effect, unless the master was standard resolution, and for a couple of the albums, you know, they were recorded to 16-bit 44.1 because that was the new shiny thing in the 80s, I've gone as close as I can to the original source and only worked from high resolution copies thereof. Well, I was fortunate that they were all recorded by Alan Parsons, who was an exemplary engineer. I mean, he didn't make a bad sounding record. You know, even on a really bad day, his stuff sounds fantastic. You know, so I'm sitting here thinking, well, this sounds really good. So all I can do is just help it on its way, treat things as gently as possible, because what's coming in is great. So the more equipment I put in the signal path, the worse it sounds. Just because I've got a console here full of equipment, it doesn't mean I need to use all of it. You know, I only use what I need to help it. And if it sounds amazing, I'll just do it flat. I won't do any work on it, because the more equipment is in the path, everything you add will smear the sound to an extent. So you have to weigh up whether what you can gain by having it in the signal path is worth the degradation that it causes by it being there. So the best thing to do is to treat things as gently as possible when you have a great recording. And because these are all recorded by Alan, they are amazing recordings. Vulture culture, well, that was a real headache. It turned out that the original master was recorded to a digital system which was called 1610, and that was a Sony digital system. And in those days there was no tape media available to record digital audio. Analog tape didn't have the bandwidth. The only system that you could record digital audio onto in those days was videotape. It had enough bandwidth to capture this digital signal. So I've got an old tape here. Here we go. It's kind of a precursor to Betamax. This is this cassette format. It's called a U-matic. You have to imagine that in the 80s we didn't have massive hard drive storage or anything like that, so you had to use tape. So we would convert the digital signal into a video signal, and it would be captured on that videotape. Problem with those tapes is they're all getting a bit old now, and they're starting to degrade, and you can get problems with dropouts where the audio just disappears for a couple of seconds. And that's becoming an issue. And the problem with analog is if you get a degradation, well, you get a bit of noise or hiss or a click, but you can normally fix that with software and with restoration tools. With digital, if you get a dropout, you fall over the cliff and it's gone. You can't come back. And we contacted Sony and said, can we have a copy of the master? And the answer came back, no, it doesn't play. It's full of dropouts. We can't recover it. You have to use this other copy. And I said, well, look, can we try? Because I've got a really good machine here that's in a great condition. Maybe I can recover it. I've worked with this format since it was new. I know all the tricks you can do to bring it to play. They wouldn't send it, and eventually we sort of just said, please, insisted, look, we're Abbey Road. I promise you'll get your tape back. You can't play it anyway, so there's no loss if we try. And thankfully, it took 4 of us fighting the machine and the tape to get it to run, and there's several edits, several passes to kind of patch bits together. But I was able to recover all of the music from the original tape. So that's now archived. So Sony have a copy of it, Alan has a copy of it. So it's all done now. Some of the tapes were very interesting. One of the albums, The Turn of a Friendly Card, I had Sony's tape, high resolution transfer, and I had Eric Woolfson's tape. And Eric Woolfson one sounded incredible, really good. Sony's one sounded nice, but not as good. But there was a massive speed difference between the two. And I was thinking, well, I like the sound of Eric's one, which was running a bit faster. But, I checked Sony's tape, and then I have a very good friend of mine who's a bit older than me. He's a massive audiophile, and he has an original pressing of Turn of a Friendly Card cut in this building with Alan attending the cut. So this is the original Arista Records UK pressing, and I thought, well, that's got to be the right speed because Alan was on the session. It's from the masters. And that was the same speed as Sony's tapes. So I said, right, then we have to slow down Eric's to match the original one. Got it all done, sent it to Alan. He said, well, why is that one running slow? So turned out it's always been wrong. He said to me, oh, it needs to be pitched up by this amount. And that was pretty much exactly the amount I had slowed it down to match what we thought was the right copy. But it turned out it's always been a little bit slow. So educated guess is the recording machine that made the master that went to Arista and was used was running very slightly fast at the time, whereas the machine that recorded the tape that went to Eric Woolfson was correct. But Alan checked it. He's checked the pitch of everything. He's gone through everything with a fine-tooth comb. I'll do my thing. I sent the files to Alan to check. He's checked everything, and nothing was cut without his approval. Because he knows this. I mean, I know a lot of this music, but he knows it way, way better than me because he has this history of having recorded it and put the people together and performed on it. I think the album I'm most proud of in this box set is the one that I was really drawn to at the time when it came out, and that's Eye in the Sky, which I would imagine would be his biggest selling album. It's just incredible. The songwriting is incredible. The musicians are fantastic. You've got Eric singing on it and singing the lead track. Then you've got Colin Blanceau singing the last track. I mean, it's a masterpiece. It's just a great record. So they're all good, but because I had a personal investment with that album, having heard it for the last nearly 40 years, it was great to be involved with that. Vulture Culture was the most challenging, just to persuade the machine to run, because not only are the tapes getting old, all of the machines are getting old, and nobody makes the spare parts for the machines anymore. So we have to just treat them very carefully and keep the heads clean. But I'm fortunate here that the machine we've got in really good condition still. The heads have still got very low hours. So if anybody can recover a tape in that format, then it's probably here, because our machine isn't as tired as some of the other ones. Eventually all the machines will break, or all the tapes will stop working, and that will be consigned to history. But for the time being, we're still able to recover from that format. It probably took a couple of months overall, because it's 11 albums. That's a lot of work. And then Alan has requests for, he wants some revisions or some stuff to be changed, which is fair enough. It's his music. He should be the final say on all of this, because he's the person closest to it. So yeah, I guess a couple of months, and then I have the process. I do a test cut onto an acetate, which I'll listen to, and if that's good, then I do the masters, and then the test pressings come back. There was one test pressing I had to tweak something because I wasn't happy with the way it sounded. I could cut it and I could play an acetate of it, but they couldn't press it, so we had to just adjust something slightly. There's always a bit of to and fro, but it's I was 2 to 3 months. There's always the questions with test pressings. You often hear a little click or a crackle somewhere. I mean, test pressings are never as good as finished production records. So you always have to have 2 or 3 copies to double check that any noise or crackle or click you hear is random and not consistent. If you hear the same click in the same place on multiple copies, then you have to flag it up with the factory. And there was a bit of that. But on the whole, most of the problems were random, so they can be disregarded. If I hear a click in side 1, track 3 at 1 minute, and I then play another test pressing, and at that point there's no click there, you know that the first one's a random click. That's not a problem. But on the whole, they were okay. And a couple that needed we sort of said, not sure about this one, can you fix this or that? Every point we flagged up, they were able to resolve. Alan's actually a very easy person to work with, because he trusts me, and I know his recordings are good, so he knows I'm not going to do any processing that doesn't need doing, and I know that I'm going to get a great source. So it was actually very, very easy. He's obviously based in Los Angeles. He did pop in earlier this year, but I've only met him a couple of times. But we speak on the phone, we have video calls, we just bounce ideas backwards and forwards. But it was a very, very easy process. It wasn't difficult at all to work with Alan. How do I know? I don't know. Gut feeling, I guess. I mean, I've done this for quite a long time now, so you tend to know what's going to work and what doesn't work. If I'm happy and if the artist is happy, then I guess that's it, really. We have to sort of shake hands and release everything off into the world. You can never make everything perfect. I mean, there's no such thing as a perfect recording. You can't. It's an unachievable goal. It's always going to be a imitation of a real performance. But you can get close. So the trick is to not spend forever changing it and tweaking it and fiddling with it, because in the end you go down a rabbit hole and you forget what it is you're trying to do. So you have to reach a point where you sort of draw a line in the sand and you say, this is amazing, let's let it go now. Well, I hope everybody likes it. I mean, we've really tried hard. I mean, nobody sets out to upset anybody. We want to make the audiophiles happy. My whole goal in life, all I've ever done is work on making records sound good. That's either a spectacular lack of ambition, because I've done the same job for nearly 40 years, or it's a dedication to the cause. You can take your pick. But I'm all about making things sound as good as they can, and that was Alan's process when he was recording this stuff. So I hope everybody likes it. It was great to work on this stuff. What I actually really liked listening to was listening to Eric singing. And I've heard anecdotally that he was a bit shy about his voice, apparently. I don't know this. I've never met Eric, unfortunately. But, I mean, I can imagine it would be a bit inhibiting, working with all these amazing singers like, Lenny Zacatec and Alan Clark and Gary Brooker and David Payton, all these, John Miles, all these fantastic rock voices that you hear. But there's something about Eric's voice that just is really, it's authentic. It's maybe because he was the composer, so he had a vested interest in it, but it resonates. There's a real kind of, when he sings Eye in the Sky or Time, you just feel that he really means it, and there's something there that's just beautiful. So to actually listen to his voice and on the big monitors in the studio here, it's just something, you get shivers down your spine. So he may not be technically as amazing as these rock gods that Alan has worked with over the years and was able to call upon to help do these albums, but there's something really special there with Eric.